And most of the homes in our research network have solar as well, which I'll talk about why that is in a minute. And so the data that we collect is a lot more useful for looking at what are specific strategies that you can develop from a policy or a technology perspective to enable more efficient and effective grid management as we have more intelligence coming onto our grid and more clean energy, which also brings more intelligence coming onto the grid. And a couple of years ago, we updated all of our research devices from 1 minute to 1 second interval data. Again, this was at the request of a lot of our university researchers we partner with, who were seeing, with increasing penetration of distributed solar, a lot more sub-second, millisecond voltage spikes coming onto the grid. And there's research being done across the country to understand what are the real grid impacts when you start to have higher levels of adoption of distributed energy. How do we better knit together the seams between smart homes and smart grid? And that 1 second interval data was pretty crucial to being able to understand some critical questions that were arising in areas where we do have dense PV. So this again just gives you a snapshot of what's the difference, what can you tell differentially with 1 hour, 1 minute, and 1 second data, and why that might be useful for research into grid management. We additionally, at the same time, expanded the data points that we collect from each circuit from basically just voltage, just kind of use, to include a number of variables around power quality, which again is emerging as a more important question as we see more distributed resources coming online. And to give a little bit more insight into the importance of high frequency data, high time variability data, I'm just going to show you a few data slides from specific appliances. And this also demonstrates why it's important to look at this level of detail around homes and around how buildings use energy, because different appliances have very different load profiles, but also very different grid impacts based upon their power quality, based on the types of typical motors that are used to power them, and also how they're used within households, how behavior intersects with the actual performance of technologies. HVAC, you can see, is pretty good power quality on most of these systems. So that's why you don't see a lot of variability between 1 second and 1 minute data. You're not getting a lot of spiky energy use, funky things happening on the grid, but there is a lot of difference between 1 hour and 1 minute data, which shows us where we have opportunities to do some pretty significant load management, demand response for grid stability. I someday understand this tool here. Okay, refrigerators, lots of spikiness that we see. And so there's a lot of opportunity here to address quality of those appliances in homes, less ability to address that from more of a behavioral perspective, teaching people how to set their HVAC, for example, so you don't have so much rapid cycling, how to properly size HVAC systems so they go into households and don't cycle as frequently because they're over or under cooling or heating. With refrigerators, it's really about appliance codes and standards to get these to be more efficient sources of energy use on our grid. Solar, which is the big one that most of us are looking at right now, is very spiky, and that's in part because of the intermittency of the resource, but it's also in part because when you have solar providing power directly to a home, it provides the real power to the household, and it reveals the reactive power that the utility's been serving that was probably not visible to the utility before the solar came online. And this was a question we spent quite a lot of time looking at about a year ago, as more regulatory agencies and utilities were seeing that when solar comes online, they were having a lot more voltage spikes on the grid, on the lines where they had higher penetrations of solar. And they thought the solar was causing it. And we're looking at how do we regulate, how do we manage this? But in reality, the solar was just revealing a problem that already existed, and it's not the problem in and of itself. So again, having that really high fidelity data has proven critical to understanding a lot of the challenges and opportunities that we have with clean and distributed integration, and making sure that we're addressing them with the right approaches to solve problems, not exacerbate them. This is just even a little bit more of a granular look at solar and how it impacts the grid, and can cause a lot of disruptions, and why it's important to get our hands around that real-time management of resources as well as use. Within our test bed, we also have a high number of homes with electric vehicles. So across the country, we monitor right now about 1,000 households across the decade that we've been doing this, we've monitored about almost 2,000 households. All of that data is available in our database. The homes are centered in Austin, which was the photo that you saw a little bit earlier. We've set up an initial partnership with one community in Austin. It was a new built community. They were infilling an old airport. The community was green built. We had a lot of variable control because the homes were all being put in with the same standards of building quality, similar appliances, similar age. So really interesting research case. Additionally, it's a green community and it's pretty expensive to move there. So we had households that had some disposable income. We're really interested in participating in our research. So we got some grants to provide those households with incentives to install solar facing different directions, as well as to get electric vehicles. And so we've been able to collect a lot of data around that specific question of distributed energy deployed within what we think is likely to be the neighborhood of the near future in many parts of our country. And as we've collected this data and as we've had events that have happened that we've monitored now over the past decade, things like the big winter storm in Texas last February, where we had a lot of grid outage, we are able to look at how do these resources perform under those circumstances, and also what additional services can they provide to the grid for resiliency and affordability that we're not currently tapping into. And the data that we collect allows system modelers to have a much more accurate picture of what are the opportunities here and how can we better leverage these resources, which then we can hopefully bring economists into also helping us understand, well, how do we really value out what these services could be and how do we create a regulatory and a financial environment that compensates for them or incentivizes these household or building-based technologies to work in a way that has an overall grid benefit. So from the level of data that we get, we're actually able to pull out individual cars because they all have different charging profiles. And then we're able to look at what are the different services that these various vehicles could provide. And it is based primarily on the size of their battery and that therefore the resource that they have available to the grid, either for dispatchable generation, if we have vehicle to grid capabilities, or to serve as a very effective, very high impact shiftable load for demand management. We modeled out what would have been possible if more of the homes that have EVs in our research network had been able to provide power back to the grid in Texas when we had our statewide outage last year, which has been helpful in trying to make the case to the Texas Public Utility Commission that we need to address interconnection standards so that these resources can provide power back to the grid when the overall grid goes down. And then we've also used this data to start a new project that's funded by the Department of Energy, where we're figuring out how do you network individual homes that have EVs or that have battery storage so they can provide black start capabilities to an entire community that has a grid outage. And additionally, with the data that we collect, we conduct annual socio-demographic surveys of all of the households in our research network. So we're able to get information about the home attributes that's important to understanding the energy profiles in the home, occupant socio-demographic information, number of people that live there, their age, their race, their relative income, information about the large appliances in their household, including what kind of car they have, if they charge when they're outside of the home, or if they're only charging within the home. So we can start to get a real picture of the potential role that electric vehicles in particular here can play for the grid at the household, but also just out in the community. And one of the interesting trends that we've seen over the past year is that the charge rate is increasing. While charge time remains flexible, we found through different research trials we've done that EV owners are very willing to participate in demand response programs. They're very willing to shift when they charge their vehicles based upon conservation messaging or based upon price signals. That as newer cars are moving into households, those cars have larger batteries and they charge at a higher rate, at a higher draw, which can be a really great benefit to utilities. This can again be a really powerful grid management tool that's newly available. It could also be a really big problem if they don't proactively think about how to manage and incentivize these vehicles to be used in a way that benefits the grid instead of causing more problems. And with collecting power factor data, which is some of the new grid characteristics data that we're getting now at the 1 second interval, And as we've spread across the country to not only focus on Texas, but the coast and now areas that have a higher representation of communities of color, we're able to do some really interesting comparisons, which have hopefully utilization for all kinds of energy grid system management approaches. But interestingly, you can see that in Texas, we have really poor power factor at the homes and at the grid compared to New York, which was a surprise to us because you use a toaster oven the same way, whether you live in Texas or New York. You're going to heat and cool your house for the most part the same way once you normalize for temperature degree day. So understanding why we're seeing this kind of variability region by region is going to be a big question going forward, but at least we have some clues into these are issues, these are curiosities, mysteries that we really need to solve. We really need to understand why they're happening. And then again, as we introduce different kinds of generation onto the grid and different kinds of grid system management, what do we need to understand is different for our grid system models to be effective and our economic approaches to be effective. So we at our team take a lot of this information and we try to, again, just get it out into the world so smart researchers like you guys can really use it to make impact, help us figure out how to run our systems differently. But we also try to get this information translated and available to decision makers and policymakers in a way that we can remove roadblocks to having a cleaner, smarter future here in our country, and also be advocating and incentivizing for technologies and solutions that get us where we want to go. So they get us to a decarbonized grid, they get us to a more affordable, resilient grid. In addition to this paper that we put out last year, some other examples of research that we put out are modeling out what would be the impacts to the grid and emissions from the state of Texas if all of the single family homes that are currently powered with natural gas for heat switch to electric heating. What would be the new capacity requirements that are required to do that? And we used historic weather data to run this model. We ran over 40 million simulations. Took the hottest year in the past decade, the coldest winter in the past decade, and also created kind of a medium normal year for us. That report was really useful to help our grid system planners understand how to look at these challenges, how to take an engineering, a data-based approach to creating more effective energy policy and more effective market signals. That whole research paper was blown out of the water this past year with our winter storm, because we need new weather system and integrated energy system planning models that don't exist yet. So we're trying to collect the data that can help inform those models and those decisions from an engineering and a technology side. But we're trying to find partnerships right now to help us understand how do we model weather as we're looking at these potential market scenarios. We also, because we're in homes and we have a community-based approach, look at the micro level, at the behavioral level, that side of the equation for technology transition. As more policies are being implemented across the country around electrification and not letting new buildings be constructed with natural gas or requiring that all homes transition to electric heating and cooling. We had a number of companies reach out to us and ask for electric panel capacity data. How much capacity is available in a home right now, both homes that are already all electric and homes that are heated with natural gas. We collected data from Texas and New York to answer this question. We had our volunteers send in pictures of their electric panel, and then we were able to utilize the data that we collect from those homes to figure out what's that delta, what's that remaining available capacity. And then we compared that to building codes and how those have changed over the past decade and what's coming down the pike. And we found that about half of the homes in the country seem to have sufficient capacity right now to be all electric, if you're not including electric vehicles and home charging in that equation. But about half the buildings don't, and current building codes are not sufficient to enable households to be all electric. So bringing together communities, bringing together individuals to help us rapidly collect data about what's actually happening in their homes, about what's happening on the customer side of the meter, and how building policy and building codes interacts with our potential to have more effective energy codes, is another area that we're always looking at, and we're always happy to have research questions fielded to us. Because we're intentionally not a team of researchers. We're intentionally a team of engineers, problem solvers, data analysts, and we rely on our university research partners and collaborators to tell us where to go next so that we can collect the data that's useful. But in realizing that all of those companies were asking us to collect this data is what got us to look at that question. Is this an important policy question? Why are corporations investigating this right now? And it proved to be a really important one. And we found that the cost to upgrade all of the homes that wouldn't have sufficient electric capacity right now would be over $100 billion. And so as we're talking about policy and investment, really looking at the policies might seem easy and the technology swaps might be easy, but what's the cost? And how do we want to use our funds to have the most effective transition? Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah. So the question is, how are we dealing with both data privacy and data security within, I'm guessing, the homes that we monitor, so specifically our monitoring technology? Yeah, so I'll get a little bit more into kind of broader questions of data privacy and security later in the presentation, but for our specific instruments that we use, we do have a fairly simple but a very effective privacy policy that we developed in partnership with the Department of Energy when we started doing this field-based research and data collection over a decade ago. And the data is bifurcated, so there's never any personally identifiable information or locational information that's transmitted to us along with the data packets that we get in real time from homes. We have a key, a spreadsheet that's held on one secure server that maps between the randomly generated home IDs that we use and personally identifiable information that we need in order for us to operate our volunteer test beds. And we've never had any violations of those processes. We've never had anybody that's been able to access PII without a specific agreement that the household gives a specific company or person access to that information. And on the cybersecurity side, we do have a lot of protocols in place to prevent our data from being hacked, to prevent it from being accessed. That's always been very secure, even though we've had threats to our database. But even if somebody did hack it, our primary security is that there's no way for anybody who could access that data without authorization to, again, figure out where those homes are, who is being monitored with our system. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So one of the other areas that we're working in now that we're really excited to see movement in is expanding access to utility generated data around how power is used in buildings, but also around distributed generation performance on specific buildings. And what we think is the marquee effort in this space is in New York State right now. They've launched an integrated energy data resource platform initiative where the state of New York is requiring that all of the regulated utilities put into one central platform that will be run by the state, all of the data from their customers about how they're using energy, as well as other data sets that have been identified by stakeholders is critical for doing research or solutions development or targeting of clean energy solutions to customers. So this is a massive effort. And I'm sure those of you that have tried to work on data access or doing research around grids have an idea of the barriers that are faced by getting any of this information out of utilities. And Pecan Street is a consultant to the state of New York in helping them respond to questions or concerns that utilities raise from the legal side, as well as the technical data side, on being able to share this information, get it digitized, get the data to be comparable across utilities and across different parts of the state and available to third parties to use for research. So we're helping them think through privacy standards, cybersecurity standards, data cost, how to handle data digitization on the utility side, how to handle access requests from third parties. But it's a huge effort that lots of people in New York are working on. It's in its first year. By the end of next year, the first phase, so the top 5 use cases that were identified as being important to accelerating clean energy in New York State, for which this data is needed, the data for those 5 use cases will be available. And then after the next 2 years, hopefully all the data will be available. And one of the ongoing challenges is legal precedents to share data. And I'm going to talk a lot about that a little bit later in the presentation. because as you saw with the data that we have, when you have access to high fidelity, very time granular data, you can tell a whole lot about what's happening on the grid and a whole lot about how to solve problems. And that data is really, really important to having accurate scenarios and accurate modeling of what's going to happen on the grid under different scenarios of power generation transfers as we make this transition. But also, how do we do real-time load balancing between supply and demand, which again is going to be critical to make this transition affordably and reliably for households. So right now in most areas, if you're able to get compensated for renewable generation, for solar that you have on your roof, you're just getting compensated for power that you provide to the grid, that one thing. But there's a lot of value that DERs provide because they have embedded intelligence. They have an ability to ramp quickly where power is needed, that utilities aren't taking advantage of, much less figuring out what's the value of those and how do we compensate and send the right market signals. But a part of the reason that this value is left on the table is because these services are primarily based on being able to control and access information from these distributed resources in real time and being able to respond on a frequency that requires decision-making at that device level. So not a central command center taking in data from distributed devices, figuring out what the response should be for specific homes or regions. That will take too long to get a lot of the value extracted from these devices. There needs to be some way that there's real-time decision-making happening, which is automated intelligence. So we started trying to develop an architecture to help utilities really understand what might be the management, the control structure to enable that real-time response, that real-time control for distributed devices to respond to events that were happening on the grid, not only to respond to what's happening in the house or the building, but to respond to what they're observing about grid conditions and grid needs, as well as to hopefully enable the deployment of software where we can have, forecasting and more rapid response and participation from these resources too. And we were really just honing in on the architecture, the control processes that we're hearing from utilities, their major concerns about, right? Well, we can't just have a bunch of uncontrolled devices doing whatever they want on the grid, responding to local conditions, because in aggregate, that will create enormous amount of chaos. We still don't understand how do we do this with cybersecurity? How do you integrate data from homes, from private devices that utilities have no control over? There's no standardization around firmware upgrades or cybersecurity for these devices right now. How would you possibly integrate that with the grid system and keep it secure? That question we still don't really have an answer to, but we can answer a lot of the questions about just control for security and control for purpose. And when I started trying to think about this with our CTO, who was drawing very complicated engineering diagrams and hierarchical decision-making trees, my 6-year-old daughter was also at the time getting very interested in octopuses. So we were learning a lot about the neurobiology and watching a lot of the documentaries that have come out over the past couple of years around octopus intelligence. And I just finally, it clicked. I said, what you're talking about is an octopus. And he thought I was crazy, but we kept workshopping it and basically took this model of embedded intelligence, which is what octopuses have. Across their body, they have sensors that are collecting information about their environment. And each of those sensors, each part of the octopus's body is making decisions independently about what to do. But there is control, there is coordinated movement, there is direction. The species survives and thrives because some decisions are retained within the control of the octopus's kind of central brain. But it's really thinking about the grid as a system, a structure that has embedded intelligence. And so you can have some decisions that are the purview of these distributed assets and other decisions that are the purview of central command. And we're not going to probably get to a totally distributed energy system in our lifetimes. So we have to figure out how do we create this hybrid process and what is the structure and the architecture for that. So this is sort of our take, my very clumsy communications take on what are the different services and the different decisions that these nodal aspects, these individual devices can do. And of course, within banded parameters for safety and for progress instead of chaos. And then what are the decisions that central command really needs to maintain control over, which is primarily market regulation, market management, and cybersecurity. And we're really proud of ourselves because we even came up with a really great acronym for this. this architecture to overlay more of his engineering schematics. And I can talk more about, specific AI applications, but since this is not a room of data scientists, I thought I'd focus more on the energy side and the services and benefits and specific challenges. And one of the specific challenges that is still the main challenge we're facing with being able to advance this solution, for which we have all of the intelligence right now on the grid. We have all of the AI models that we need in order to create these control schemas that can respond in real time, that can provide these critical benefits and services to people. But what we don't have is the policy solutions for data management. So the purple Cybersecure data layer, that doesn't exist yet. Utilities don't really want to own that and be responsible for that. You can't have private sector companies like Google or Apple or whoever might dominate the smart home space own that. There needs to be a political structure for data management. Data should be considered, in my opinion, its own utility and have regulation and management that reflect that. Because data is functionally a utility in our life across many spectrums, but energy is a primary one where it certainly is increasingly going to play a critical role. And an example of the importance of solving this problem is locational data, which similarly was the purview of the military. This data, GPS data, was famously opened up under the Clinton administration, not with really any specific kind of idea or industry in mind, but because there were enough calls from researchers to make this data available. So they put some security standards around it, but in 1983, some of the first maps were made publicly available, and in 2000, they actually made access to the real data available. And then from there, we've seen a huge boom in how locational data is a part of most of our daily lives now. And we've had a huge economy and big companies that have been built around having access to this data. We think we're going to see similar economic shift once we open up access to energy data in a similar way. But we have to solve really big problems, and nobody's really talking about it in the energy sector. But I think the problems are going to get solved by the energy sector because we need them to be in order to really make this transition to clean energy quickly and safely, again, and affordably and equitably. So we know there's a lot of concern about data access and data privacy in the tech sector. As we talk about locational data, that's a prime one. Who are phones sharing your data with about where you are? They're tracking it all the time. The New York Times, for me, infamously, I'm not sure if everybody saw this study, but in 2018, they were able to gain access to one of their coworkers' locational data and mapped where she went. She ended up agreeing to have the data shared publicly, but there's some pretty interesting things in here. And when you start having really high fidelity data made available about how individual homes and buildings are using energy, you can see similar trends in what we're doing in our personal lives. This problem still isn't solved. But again, we need it to be, but we need more energy researchers talking about this, and we need more integration across data science and cybersecurity domains with our energy research in order to really figure out what are the policies and procedures to enable access to building level high fidelity energy data without causing more security threats or more harm to individuals, and without doing it in a way that's predatory. And what I mean by that is, say you're a low-income household, a private energy services company in New York is able through this new data platform to see how much energy you use and where you live. And they approach you with an opportunity to have a lower energy bill, and in exchange, you agree to share all of your data with them. Well, there's no standards right now for how they could then utilize that data, what kind of assessments or analysis could be done on that data, but you're more likely to agree to it if you're in a position where you really care about having a lower energy bill. And those kinds of opportunities are coming. They're already coming in Texas with our deregulated electricity market. Households that are in lower income census tracts are targeted for participation in electric schemas that under most normal circumstances would reduce and lower energy bills, but under catastrophic weather events or extreme weather events, enormous energy bills. And that's very predatory. And we need to get a handle on how this data is used and by whom. And so again, we're advocating that data really be considered a regulated utility, a regulated structure. In the state of Ohio last summer, their attorney general filed suit to get the Google web search engine classified as a utility. So that's one example of how this is starting to play out legally. New York State establishing their own regulated data platform where they're taking ownership, control over all of the utility data is another pathway. But the privacy questions around how they can do that are still somewhat unanswered. But we don't really have time for every state to independently figure out how to do this, how to open up access to these critical energy data sets that we need to really get the solutions right for clean energy. I believe that we need a federal approach and a federal solution. And again, we have a model for that within the energy sector and how we think about energy regulations, how we think about consumer protections. But we need to take that model and apply it to data as its own service and system. Thank you. So I'm happy to dive deeper into any of the things we talked about. I can go back to any slides or just answer questions. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that? Is this a new concept? Like what was an example of that?
Yeah, so I'm happy to repeat it too, either way.
So I was wondering if she could talk more about the predatory practices and related to energy bills and energy data.
Yeah, so one of the examples is what I talked about in the deregulated electricity market in Texas, where you have just competitive utility providers and lots of different kinds of plans that are available, hundreds of plans that can be available to any person. And it's really difficult to sort through what's the right one for me. And you are less likely to have the time and the ability to sit on your computer and look through the platform that our PUC created that lists out all of those options available to you, that tries to break down what your likely energy bill might be under different scenarios. And so what we're finding is that there's marketing getting targeted specifically to lower income census tracts for plans that end up costing more because there's not good insight into this information, into your own energy use, much less into how to evaluate different options that are being brought to you. There's also quite a bit happening around predatory lending on solar financing in lower income communities, and communities of color being targeted by private solar companies. Again, with claims that it's going to save money, it's going to keep you powered during a grid outage. And in reality, it's not saving many of these households money. It puts them at risk to be able to stay in the home because it's increasing their total monthly cost. And we're doing a project with NREL right now to investigate that. It's a problem that's being documented more anecdotally in literature among clean energy advocates, but trying to figure out how do we bring transparency into the process of figuring out, with solar power specifically, is this system technically going to do what I want? Is my goal to save money overall on my energy cost? Is my goal to be able to keep my home powered in the event of an outage? Those are somewhat complicated questions for just a lay person to be able to answer when they're being presented with specifications for solar and potentially energy storage. But then also we're going to develop a online financial platform that provides just basic information to calculate what the monthly bill is going to be under different interest rates and payment periods, and then to bring in your energy bill and to really understand what's going to be the financial impact to me of signing up for this service. And because there's not much utility integration with these private sector companies anymore, again, there's just a lack of ability to access data as an individual, a lack of ability for utility or any kind of a regulatory entity to be accessing information about energy use and demographics and participation in programs. Is that okay? We saw some similar things in New York State as well in the early aughts with energy service companies, ESCOs, coming into the marketplace, trying to sell. A lot of it was around energy retrofits, and you'll save X amount of money on your bill, and so you'll pay us with your savings, 50% or 70%. But then fine print in many of those contracts that says, well, if you're not sticking to using these appliances or using the new HVAC system within the settings that we're providing to you. You're in default of your contract and you have to pay us back no matter what. And many of those contracts were not actually having the experience on households that the households thought they were going to have. They weren't saving money. They still owed all of this money to these ESCOs. And that prompted New York State to pass a bunch of consumer protection laws around access to energy data and utility data, which is now part of what we are trying to figure out what's the right balance in New York State with being able to have a state still as a third party to utility, but a government entity try to get a handle on access to data. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. So I'm curious about your octopus neural system. So, you know, for our human being, we are controlled by two neural systems, right? The first is controlled by spine. So they make decision based on the sensor gathered from environments, right? But they make decision based on intuition. If we get hurt, we will bounce back. It's our reaction to dangers. And the second system is our head, right? So we interpret the sensor we gather from environment, the data. That's why we can see images and voice and have unconsciousness. So, but I'm curious, there is a clear decision boundary between these two neural systems, right? And also they are interconnected. For example, I got hurt, I bounce back, but I can consciously get hurt. I can choose consciously to touch fire to burn me. So that's kind of interconnection. I'm wondering, in your octopus system, your two neural network system, actually three, right? Because you have data gathered from your home. Do you have clear boundary between the centralized neural network system and decentralized neural network system? Clear boundary for that?
Yeah. So that is the main, kind of at the most fundamental level, the main architectural principle is that there is a very clear bifurcated decision-making process, but we need to do a lot of analysis on our finding out what's the actual scenarios, and then utilizing the kind of data that the country gets on performance of those distributed systems in order to set the parameters for the decision on each of those networks.
So there may be some conflicts, right?
There might be, but again, it's fairly, I mean, figuring out what the parameters are is not fairly simple. That's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we have a lot of the data that's needed for that. But again, you can set up the decision-making hierarchy, the hierarchical architecture so that if there is a conflict, you go down to kind of the base level of risk.
Yes,
so it's
you
not
mean
giving total, autonomy to individual systems. You set up the parameters so that they have bounded decision.
And the parameter is learned by data, by failure events, or
perhaps, but
maybe
unlikely in the first generation for these to be learned AI.
And another interesting idea is to put adversarial attack to the system, like the game works. There's a discriminator to judge the system whether it's fire or not, and dynamic update it.
Yeah, and that's one of the benefits of actually moving to this architecture, that individual devices can monitor their neighboring devices, which allows for much more rapid detection of threat vectors and isolating anything that might be compromised on a customer side before it really creates havoc on the grid. And that can happen at that millisecond level that's needed to really prevent a full-scale attack from happening. But you have to enable that kind of real-time automated response between devices.
So that builds a connection. Okay. My second question is more non-technical. So your data set is a lot of your data sets try to serve New York State, but why you set the headquarters on UT Austin? Austin. And are there specific reasons for what kind of community there in Austin comparing with like California or New York? Is that are there more weighted financial reasons, or it's more based on community?
So the organization started with our data collection in Texas, in Austin. The first 1,000 city was committed to figuring out how do we leverage what's unique about Austin. We have a municipally owned utility, we have a progressive government, we have a big tech industry. They wanted to leverage all of that to have Austin really become a leader in understanding smart infrastructure with the specific intention of using smart infrastructure to accelerate clean energy on our coast. So we worked with the city and were able to get a Department of Energy grant as really the first funding of the organization to do this big research project, set up this community-based test bed in the city that we're getting all this data out of, but also those homes then serve as a test bed to get rapid feedback on technology, potential technology policy solutions. And then that model was so successful and that data has been used around the world. So we've been asked to go into other states, both by researchers saying we need geographic comparative data, or New York and the state of California saying we're really trying to figure out what are the right sets of policies and economic mechanisms to enable more clean energy onto the grid more quickly. Can you come give us data because we really need this kind of data to figure out our policies.
So more data, actually.
Yeah, more data. But so all of the homes that we instrument are single family, and we prioritize bringing households into our research network that have solar or electric vehicles because those were the data sets that our researchers were asking for. However, that resulted in our data being overwhelmingly comprised of upper income white households. And when we realized this data is being used around the world to create energy policy, and it's being based on a very small slice of the individuals that actually constitute our country. And we don't understand what the potential impacts of that might be because we don't have data from lower income communities or communities of color to understand, are the behavioral patterns consistent no matter what your income, no matter what your race? Is your likelihood to participate in different programs, to respond to market incentives, to respond to communications-based programs different based upon your income, based upon your geography, again, based upon demographics? We don't know. So right now we're focusing on trying to bridge that energy equity gap. It's actually a big area of study and focus now that a number of researchers are working on, closing the energy equity data gap for better grid system planning. And that's why we're bringing online new research networks in Detroit and Puerto Rico this summer, so we can start to bring a bit more diversity to our research.
Thank you for the answers.
Thank you.
Pretty insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for the presentation. My first question is, you had showed the solar data and you also mentioned that they had a lot of fluctuations in it. So this is just in thought that the fluctuations in the solar and previously also in other solar data by like different organizations, even by EIA and all, we have seen that they have a lot of fluctuations. So is that like a hybrid model of solar and natural gas that is causing this these fluctuations, because it's only some of the utilities that the solar is being used for, or can it be applied like thoroughly to the households?
Are you asking if the solar is being used just for specific circuits?
Yes.
So all of the solar on homes that we collect data on is connected to the grid. So it ties into the main line of the home. So it's not powering individual right to that pool. And the fluctuations are driven primarily by weather, by intermittency of cloud cover. However, the actual fluctuations in voltage that the utility sees where you have solar on homes is driven by a combination of weather-based intermittency and poor power quality. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my second question was more of a journal question. I wanted to know like a little bit like a brief about your entrepreneurial journey, how it happened. So it's more kind of journal question.
Okay. For how I came to be doing this
Yeah.
work. Okay. Sure. Thank you. So the idea for Pecan Street to serve as a community-based research network, community-based data generation, came from a lot of the work that I had been doing on sustainability planning in other countries, but also in New York, and understanding just the importance of data on what's actually happening in the world, in people's homes. What do people want? How do they feel about it? What's the actual impact of different technologies and policies once they're out in the world? And that's really important in order to make sure that whatever policies we put into place have the impact that we want. So we wanted to try to get a lot more data, a lot more insight and visibility in the energy sector, because we were aware that this is a problem with being able to decarbonize our energy system. And then I thought that it was really important that we make sure we have a community-based approach to doing that, because if we're only looking at the quantifiable data, the sensor data, we're missing a huge part of the picture on the behavioral side and preferences side. So that was how we came to do this work.
Thank you. So just a quick follow-up question for the data gathering, are you right now looking at a particular community, or like it's varied?
Yeah, right now we're getting data from homes in Texas, primarily Austin. About half of the homes in Austin are in that new community that I was talking about earlier, and the other half are spread around Austin because we wanted more diversity in the housing stock we're collecting data from. And then we're getting data from 50 homes in the Bay Area, and we'll be getting data from 75 homes in Detroit. We're getting data from 100 homes in upstate New York, and we'll be getting data from 75 homes in Puerto Rico. But we also have another, it's about 150 just homes randomly around the country that have solar that have signed up for our data sharing program. So we get data from their solar system, which gives us whole home use and solar generation, but not the circuit level data we have here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, in Colorado, sorry, we have 75 homes in Colorado.
So I just want to ask a question on behalf of Lara again. What's next for you as a company, and how can we work with you as a university?
That's my favorite question. So we have so many ways that we work with universities. You can use our data. We have data, we release it 1 year at a time on 75 homes, 25 in New York, 25 California, 25 Texas. These are homes with solar and EV for free to all university researchers. And it's really high quality data. We can license out access to the full database. It has a small fee for universities, which covers our team's time to really work with you in using the data because it's over a petabyte. So we end up doing a lot of the querying on our side and explaining the data and cleaning it up. And we love to hear from you on what data sets you need, because that is what drives us doing our next project. Our next data collection effort is knowing what are you working on and what data do you need in order to be more effective or in order to complete your research project. And then we also do a lot of joint funding proposals with universities. Either we'll come up with an idea and find some of our researcher collaborators to be partners with us on it, or vice versa, where we come in. We're doing a project with the University of Michigan right now. It's the second iteration of it, the second round of federal funding, where we're helping to collect data so a researcher can develop new algorithms for HVAC, faster rapid response on HVAC demand response. And then we're building out gateways in the hardware software package to go in a home so that we'll actually have a year of demonstrating that and collecting data on how that works. So we do a lot of that kind of co-development and testing of solutions as well with researchers. We also are applying more of our community-based kind of research coordinator role to trying to further more of that kind of research and equitable energy research in the country. We have a project we're working to get funded right now with some University of Texas researchers to create a plugin overlay for energy system models that would bring in population and demographic and air quality data into the power generation models that are used right now, so that there's some transparency into those aspects of making energy system decisions. And Pecan Street's role in that would be serving as a convener and community coordinator to bring also more community-based input into what are those metrics that should be looked at, what are the existing data sets. Yeah, I think those are the main ways, and happy to always have conversations with individuals and explore that more personally. For Pecan Street, our next steps are going to be trying again to convert more of the data that we have into policy guidance around the energy side. But also, in order for us to do that effectively, we know what's happening in homes. We can release reports all day long about what we need to do to help make homes more ready for clean energy, to help better solve problems around affordability and resiliency with technology solutions. But we don't know the economic or the regulatory frameworks that are going to enable that to really happen. So I can talk all day long about AI algorithm development for solar and HVAC to balance loads within a homes or between homes. But the regulatory environment that's going to allow for that to be properly incentivized, we rely on researchers to help partner with us on that, because we don't have a big research team. We don't have any system modelers on our staff. And then we're also working more on the soil carbon sequestration side and trying to help close some critical measurement and verification gaps that exist there, so we can help create more markets faster for farmers and also better direct philanthropic investment in that space.
Just want to ask, any other questions from anyone here in the room? No, any? All right. So any questions from anyone online? I don't see any questions. So if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank Suzanne once again for taking the time to come to State College to visit us and meet with us, with our students. We very much appreciate your time and your willingness to be with us for a couple of days. Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure. It really has. This is a really wonderful campus and a great place to be doing research and work. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.